Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Toby Lloyd, and today I'll be talking with Toby Lloyd about his novel Fervor, a horror story inspired by a rereading of the Bible.
So many of the stories and legends I thought was so much harder to categorize, so much richer and more ambiguous than I was expecting. I was expecting to find straightforward moral fables where characters do something and it teaches us some sort of truth, and I don't think that's at all what's going on. The genre that it kept pointing me towards was horror.
Toby Lloyd studied English at Oxford University before moving to America to pursue an MFA in creative writing at NYU. He has published short stories and essays in Carve magazine and Los Angeles Review of Books and was longlisted for the 2021 V.S. Pritchett Short Story Prize. He lives in London. In this episode, we'll talk about wanting to write a book that speaks to a broad audience and the British Jewish experience.
Books by and about British Jews tend to be more marginal, tend to be seen as about a small minority group. And we are a very small minority group in this country compared with America. But I think more books like that, where Jews sort of sit at the heart of English literature rather than on the sidelines.
And we'll also discuss how Marcel Proust's depiction of Jewish identity feels so current today.
And I think it's the most brilliant depiction of how Jewish identity intersects with history and how the currents of history change what it means to be Jewish. I found that very resonant as someone who's not a member of the religion myself, but looked at Swan as a character whose Jewishness seems almost incidental one moment, and then because of what's going on in the world, in France, suddenly it's like the most important thing about him.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to the 5 Books, Toby. I'm really happy to talk to you today. Fervor is such an ambitious, layered, beautifully written novel. It's as much about storytelling as it is about belief and history and the emotional weight of inheritance. And it manages to be intellectually searching and emotionally haunting at the same time. It completely had me absorbed. So I'm really thrilled to talk to you about it today.
Oh, thank you so much, Talia. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm glad you like the novel so much.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book, Fervor, and how you came to tell this story?
Fervor is really about a family, the Rosenthals, and it begins at a point when the family dynamics are about to change because the patriarch of the family, the grandfather, is dying, and he is in fact a Holocaust survivor. And as he is dying, his daughter-in-law, who's a rather ambitious writer, she's a journalist, decides she's going to write his memoirs of the war, which no one wants her to write, especially not him, but she's going to do it anyway. And that's the sort of starting point of kind of everything going wrong for this family, which kind of builds towards around the figure of the daughter of the family, who becomes a sort of troubled teenage daughter, and her parents, who are very literalist believers in their religion, come to interpret what is happening to their daughter in spiritual terms. So they see her as coming under the sway of demonic influences. And the younger son of the family, Tovia, is an atheist. He's the black sheep of the family anyway, and he thinks his parents' response to what is happening to his sister is insane, that she needs psychiatric support and not to be viewed as some sort of Old Testament witch. And that is the sort of central drama of the book.
And tell us how you came to write this story.
Yeah, so I think of it as having sort of several discrete origins, one of which was that I became very fascinated by reading the Bible in my 20s. I hadn't read it seriously as an adult. I, encountered the stories as a child, and I'm not a religious believer myself, so I'm not observant. And I was really surprised by what I was reading. And the reason I was surprised by what I was reading in Genesis and Exodus especially was that so many of the stories and legends I thought was so much harder to categorize, so much richer and more ambiguous than I was expecting. I was expecting to find straightforward moral fables where characters do something and it teaches us some sort of truth, like the boy who cried wolf. And I don't think that's at all what's going on in that book. And I was fascinated by it. And I read this essay by Harold Bloom in which he argues that the Bible is often misunderstood in terms of genre, and that there's a tendency to sort of fix it in the genre of the sort of instructional fable. And actually, depending on what parts you're reading, it makes more sense to read the stories as slapstick, comedy, horror, and so on. And this, to me, really resonated with my experience of revisiting those very ancient texts. And the genre that it kept pointing me towards certain episodes was horror. I thought understanding the Bible, understanding God's sometimes cataclysmic actions in the world, you think of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, seems to be of the world of horror. Which brings me to another way into this book, which is that I love horror films. I don't read a lot of horror fiction. Big fan of sort of scary movies, and I like supernatural horror, especially. I'm thinking of Rosemary's Baby, which is a good book. I know one of your other guests spoke about it, and I was really pleased. I do like that novel. The Exorcist, more recently, The Witch, and these supernatural horror films often have a kind of Christian element. There's a sort of Christian theology or anti-theology that gets turned on its head that underlies the horror of the films. And I couldn't think of any comparable Jewish horror films, although Jewish folklore is filled with dybuks and witches and demons and golems. So I thought there's no reason for these films not to exist. And so partly what I was doing when I was writing my novel was trying to write the sort of Jewish horror film that I wanted to see. So I used to sort of say to people it's equal parts influenced by The Exorcist and by, the Book of Judges.
If you've been listening along and thinking about what your books might be, we'd love to hear about it for an upcoming listener series. Tell us about 3 books that had a big impact on your life. 1 Jewish book from childhood, 1 Jewish book from adulthood, and 1 book that changed your worldview. Then just record a short voice memo with your list and email it to us at team@fivebookspod.org. We just ask that you keep the length around 5 minutes. Thank you, and we really can't wait to hear from you. Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. The Jewish Joke, A Short History with Punchlines, by Devorah Baum.
I've chosen Devorah Baum's book about Jewish jokes. It's called An Essay with Examples, More Examples, Less Essay, a sort of joke that it's really a compendium of Jewish jokes with a little commentary tying them together. The reason I chose this, I wasn't a big reader in childhood, something that's a little bit shameful for a writer to admit. And I certainly wasn't a big reader of Jewish literature, although, as I said, I encountered the Bible stories largely through, my mother. And I was thinking about, as a child, how did my Jewish identity kind of form itself through stories and through books? And I thought, what was the jokes that we told? And that was like my sort of first stronghold on what a Jewish identity might look like, is through jokes. I love jokes. My family are joke tellers, especially Jewish jokes, which I think have a distinct character, it's hard to name exactly what it is, but you recognize it when you see it. One of the things I like about Jewish jokes is they're not ever, I think, really pun based. I think the pun is, when is the door not a door, when it's a jar, is the most pathetic kind of joke. It's just a silly coincidence of language. What I love about Jewish jokes is they often are very wise. They're similar to parables, except they make you laugh at the end. And when I read Devorah Baum's book, I recognized a lot of the jokes in there, and I felt like my childhood was being sort of handed back to me. It had been kind of gathered up and handed back to me, which was such a sort of wondrous feeling. Of course, many of the jokes I'd heard before, many of them I hadn't, but even the ones I hadn't, I sort of encountered with the same protective familiarity that I had of the jokes that I'd heard all my life. And at this point, I can't remember which is which. They've all sort of melded together, and and I think that's what happens with jokes. They start out as something outside of you, and then they become yours, and you tell them.
Is there one that stands out, a joke or a story?
Oh, there's loads. But yeah, I said earlier that I think Jewish jokes often contains some wisdom. So, I'll mention one. I like this joke a lot. We're in 19th century, Imperial Russia, two Jews are somewhere, Minsk or somewhere. And one says to the other, you know, if I was the Tsar, I would be even richer than the Tsar. And the second Jew says, what are you talking about? If you were the Tsar, you'd be as rich as the Tsar. And the first Jew says, no. If I was the Tsar, I would give Hebrew lessons on the side. And I love that joke. And I won't attempt to explain why it's funny, because we all know that doesn't work. But I will say, if you think what that joke has to say about trying to put yourself in someone's shoes, and how we can do it a bit, but even when we put ourselves in someone else's shoes, we can't help but import some idea of who we are into that other person. That's quite a deep idea to try to communicate, as you know, to a child. And that joke does so with a tremendous amount of efficiency. Very quickly communicates, I think, quite a profound idea of what it is to empathize, and what it is to sort of understand yourself and try and view other people as different from you, but having something in common with you. And so I think it's charming.
What do you think they gave you? You talked about this was your Jewish identity. What was it that you feel like these jokes gave you as a child?
I think they gave me some ideas of what it might mean to be Jewish. I think some of those are a love of paradox, I think is a common trait in Jewish jokes, which is a kind of resilience to thinking that is too simple or too reductive. And I think that's a habit of Jewish thought, that, you know, for every story, there's 10 interpretations of the story. And so the literature always breeds more literature. That's kind of seems to me connected somehow to the paradoxes that are in the Jewish jokes. I'll tell you a joke that I think communicates something about being Jewish, which is a Jew is sort of standing and minding his own business, and a man walks over and punches him in the nose. And he says, "That's for you, Mendel." And the Jew laughs. He says, "Why are you laughing?" And he says, "The joke's on you. I'm not Mendel." Yeah. And to me, that says something about resilience. And for Jews, I think that sort of suffering and hardship don't preclude humor. And it's humor that is part of what characterizes the Jewish people, and humor in the face of adversity, humor in the face of, you know, when you've got nothing else to do, at least you can laugh about life.
And what was your life like Jewishly as a kid?
Yeah, so it was in many ways not very Jewish, but then in some ways very Jewish. So as a kid, I was very convinced I was an atheist. I don't really know where this came from, but it was sort of important to me when I was like 10. My brother was bar mitzvahed, but I was like, no, I'm not going to do this. No God for me. Keep God away from me. But growing up, because of where we happened to live in London, which is not an especially Jewish area, you know, there weren't really a lot of Jews that I knew. Basically, all the Jews I knew were middle-aged women who were friends with my mum. So if you're a Jew, you're either me, my brother, or you're a middle-aged woman. You know, that was kind of it. And so it was this strange thing that kind of marked me in the way that, you know, it does, and that you're aware of it as an identity, and you're aware that things have changed in England now. But when I was at primary school and secondary school, there's a lot of Christianity in schools, and like you would go to like the religious assembly, and like I was exempt, and I would like go to this little back room, and it would be me and the like 3 Muslim kids like not being Christian together, and like, and they're talking about evolution or something. So I was aware of it as this not quite fitting into the category that almost everyone else I knew fit into. And this came up in small ways. And, you know, one of them is that the language of school kids, it was pretty not PC. It was very homophobic, and it was very sort of casually anti-Semitic as well. Like, you know, don't Jew me on that. Don't be a Jew about this. So although it was not part of my life in a sort of, I wasn't practicing the religion, I wasn't doing much to be Jewish, it was always there. And I was always aware of it as something that I belonged to.
Devour Baum writes about the Jew as the ultimate insider-outsider. Sounds like that was a bit of your experience.
Yeah, precisely.
And did you always know you wanted to write?
No. I mean, from my teens, I would say. As I said, I wasn't a big reader as a child. Most of us don't start wanting to write until we start loving books. For me, it was my teenage years, sort of 15, 16, that were the great sort of discovery when I kind of fell in love with really all art forms at once. They all kind of came to me. I became very interested in literature. I became interested in music and films, you know, and that's when I started to want to write. Yeah.
What were some of the books or authors that you loved when you discovered books and reading?
I remember going to see a play about Philip Larkin, the poet and novelist. I didn't really know who he was. And I think my parents both worked in the theatre before I was born. My mum worked in theatre admin and my dad was an actor, and they did different things by the time I came along. But we always went to the theatre for that reason. And so we'd gone to see this play about Philip Larkin. I had no interest in poetry and I didn't know who Philip Larkin was, but the play was fascinating. And in it, the actor, he sort of recited some of the poetry, which was so funny and so dark, and not what I thought poetry was being. I didn't think poetry was about someone speaking quite candidly about their lives. I mean, I had a very sort of naive kind of, poetry's about flowers kind of view of things. And I remember going out to the bookstore and buying the collected poems of Philip Larkin. I'd never bought a poetry book before. He remains a beloved writer of mine. He was hugely important to me.
Book 2, a Jewish book from adulthood, In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. This is such a funny thing to say. Can you give us a brief description of In Search of Time and then tell us why you chose it?
God, a brief description of In Search of Lost Time is maybe the most difficult podcast question I've ever been asked. Very briefly, it's about the French aristocracy and upper middle classes during the late 19th and early 20th century. It's a sort of social comedy that is narrated through the memories of this unnamed narrator who's often associated with the authors of the books, Marcel Proust. It's both a comedy of manners and a book about memory itself.
So Proust isn't usually thought of as a Jewish writer in the traditional sense. His mother was Jewish. She was from a prominent Jewish family. His father was Catholic, and he was raised Catholic and identified as such. And there's lots of debate around the portrayal of his Jewish characters. So what made you think of him in the context of your Jewish identity?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I guess when I first got your question, I was thinking of like Philip Roth and Saul Bellow and Cynthia Ozick, all of whom I love, and all of whom it would have been impossible for me to write Fervor without loving their books. But there's a common thread in those writers, apart from the fact they're American, or in Bellow's case, Canadian American, and that seems quite distant from me. They often write about Jews in Jewish communities, particularly thinking of Roth's Newark, and where the Jew is an outsider, but he's also in part of a community of outsiders in the Roth novels. And this had nothing to do with my experience of being a Jew, ever, really. I've never felt everyone I know is Jewish. As I said, just me and the middle-aged women that my mum would have over. And I was thinking about the character of Charles Swan in A Search for Lost Time, who is the ultimate assimilated Jew. He's, as you said, the insider-outsider. I think he's a fascinating depiction of an assimilated Jew. Yeah, I'll talk a bit about him. So Swan is one of the major characters in Proust's gargantuan work In Search for Lost Time. He's perhaps the only character who gets his own novella entirely devoted to him, which is called Swan in Love, which makes up part of the first volume. And when we first meet Swan, he is as un-Jewish as a character really could be. He's, as far as we can tell, he's not religious. He's completely assimilated into the upper echelons of French society. He's the friend of princesses. He's a great scholar. He's of art history. He's so much an insider that he has been made a member of the Jockey Club, which is always, I don't know why the Jockey Club, but that always seems to be the final measure if you've made it in European upper classes of that time. And I think it's very interesting that Proust does not make his narrator Jewish. You mentioned earlier that Proust identified as Catholic himself. And there's a sort of analog with the narrator of the novel is not gay either. And yet there is a very important gay character in the novel. Proust himself is, of course, gay. And there's a sense of Proust almost shipping out qualities of himself that he didn't want to explore too closely. He puts them into these other characters. I mentioned that when we first meet Swan, he's the ultimate assimilated Jew. And then something very interesting happens in the later volumes, which is basically the Dreyfus affair happens. So essentially, there's a cause célèbre, which is around this Jewish French soldier who is accused of treason. And it really divides France and between the Dreyfusards, who are in favor of Dreyfus, and the anti-Dreyfusards. And what happens at this moment is suddenly the fact that Swann is Jewish seems to become the most important thing about him. He takes Dreyfus's side. He thinks Dreyfus is wrongly accused, which history proves Swann to be right. Proust himself was also a passionate Dreyfusard. And all of his friends become anti-Dreyfusards. And not only that, they all start talking about Swann in this tremendously anti-Semitic way. They say things like, I used to believe that a Jew could be a Frenchman, but now I know that's not true. And they say how ungrateful he is that we let him in, that we made him a member of the Jockey Club, and look at what he's doing now. And I think it's the most brilliant depiction of how Jewish identity intersects with history and how the currents of history change what it means to be Jewish. I found that very resonant as someone who's not a member of the religion myself, but looked at Swann as a character whose Jewishness seems almost incidental one moment, and then because of what's going on in the world, in France, suddenly it's like the most important thing about him.
So you read this at what stage of your life?
Oh, well, I mean, it's very long. So I think it's several stages of my life. The first time, I think the translation I have is in 12 volumes. The first time I read it, I got to about volume 7 and I was in my late 20s, and I started again from the beginning. I read it all the way through, I think in lockdown. It was a lockdown cliche was read Proust. And I did the cliche, and I have no regrets.
Some of us were just baking banana bread, I just want to point out. But what do you think makes it such an enduring and influential work in the literary canon?
It's really hard to say because it's got so much against it. It's so massively long. It's so on paper boring. And lots of it is frankly boring. It's that, my feeling is that most of it is incredibly, incredibly good and rich and interesting. But it does get boring for sort of few hundred pages at a time. And the only reason you keep reading is because what's gone before is so good. You're like, oh, what if there's other stuff that's so good on the far side of it? And then there always is. He always provides you something absolutely sort of magical if you persevere. I think what Proust did was, to my mind, it's unmatched in anything I've read in terms of his ambition to show the passage of time through narrative time. And there are other novels as long. I think Knausgaard's novel is as long, the My Struggle autobiographical novel. But Proust's novel is clearly working with a much tighter structure. There are sort of things that happen in book 1 that are really picked up in, say, book 8 or book 9. They're like, oh, he planted that. He knew that it was going to go there. And whereas the Knausgaard novel has a sort of feeling of improvisation to it. And also he was interested in showing how people change across decades. And you can do that in a 400-page novel, and people do that wonderfully in a 400-page novel. But seeing that happen in a novel that I think it's like 1.25 million words long, like it's just like so long, like you feel you've been through the decades. And like right at the end of the series, the most amazing thing happens, which is like World War I happens, which because it was happening as he wrote it. And to see sort of characters come from the 19th century kind of emerge into contemporary life is just, I can't think of anything quite like it. The way he handles time, I think, is extraordinary.
Book 3, a book that changed your worldview. The Truce by Primo Levi.
So The Truce is Primo Levi's second memoir. It's a sequel to his memoir, If This Is a Man. If This Is a Man tells the story of Primo Levi's days in Auschwitz. And The Truce tells the story of his return after the liberation to his home in Turin. It's sort of like a modern day rewriting of the Odyssey. The heroes return home from the war, which makes, I suppose, If This Is a Man, a kind of Iliad, which it is in a very dark sense. It's a novel or a memoir about the war. Why did I choose it? I chose it because, well, first of all, I'm tremendously indebted to Primo Levi. I suspect almost every Jewish writer, especially any Jewish writer who chooses to write in some way about the Holocaust, is indebted to Primo Levi for the way he recounted what he did recount. And he's just the most wonderful writer. I didn't want to pick If This Is a Man. I mean, also everyone should read If This Is a Man. If you haven't read it, absolutely read it. It's a phenomenal book, and it's short. And he manages to narrate what happened in a way that is completely self-pitying and unmelodramatic, and has this sort of almost chilling neutrality. And that makes it sound almost like he's cold. He's not a cold writer. He's a deeply warm writer, but he knew that the words, the horrors speak for themselves. He doesn't have to do anything other than present things in a sort of factual way. It's an extraordinary document. Nonetheless, I do think that it's a very well-known story. Not necessarily his particular telling of it, but what happened in the camps and what that meant is something that, as a culture, I think we know quite a lot about. And the truce, which is the story of how you come out of those camps and how you return not just home literally, but return to a kind of humanity, is, I think, a less well-known story, and it's just as important. And it really picks up the title of the first book, If This Is a Man, comes from a poem that Primo Levi himself wrote. And his question is, and it's a very provocative and chilling question, he's saying, look at us who are suffering in Auschwitz. Are we still human being, really? He's not talking about the dehumanization of the guards, of the murderers. He's talking about the dehumanization of the victims. Am I still a man? Is this still a woman when we've been reduced to this? And the truce is really the answer, to my mind. It's showing the return of these victims who have been through hell back to life. And it's kind of written as a comedy, and it's a very, very dark comedy. Why I say it's a comedy is because it's just a series of escapades, and these characters, in order to kind of get their way back, they're always sort of coming up with schemes and like swindling people. His friend, he realizes he can sort of make some money from Russian peasants by injecting fish with water and making them look fatter than they are, and then selling them for more than they're worth. And, it's full of these sort of comic hijinks. But why it's a dark comedy or a black comedy, it is not what I normally think of as a black comedy, which is someone laughing sort of satirically or maliciously at the horrors of life, and thinking of writers like Nabokov or Jonathan Swift or Martin Amis. It's not that at all. The humor is very warm. It's just that side by side with the humor, you have the horrors of what they've been through. And, that nightmare is with them. But it kind of goes back to that joke I told about the Jew getting punched earlier, is that there's a sense that the world is full of horrors, but it is still funny. And it's not the horrors he's laughing at. It's not that kind of a comedy, but he's saying, look, even though we were starved almost to death, even though we saw our friends, our loved ones murdered, it's still funny when this happens, or when, at one point he's trying to sell some plates in exchange for a chicken, but it's to Russians and it's to Poles, I think, and they don't speak Polish and the Poles don't speak Italian. So he has to mime being a chicken to communicate what they're trying to say. It's very funny, but in a kind of slapsticky way. And I just think it's the most extraordinary book about what kind of healing looks like and what it might mean to walk out of hell and try and return.
It expands your view of humanity, because the horror is alongside the comedy, is alongside the kindness, all of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it also expands my view of literature. Primo Levi specifically puts in these references to the Odyssey and Homer, and thinking of the Iliad and the Odyssey alongside the death camps to me, it changed how I might think of the Trojan War, which of course, would have been full of its own horrors.
Levi once said that the need to tell our story to the rest, to make the rest participate in it, had taken on for us the character of an immediate and violent impulse. How does that impulse resonate for you?
Yeah, it's a striking turn of phrase, isn't it? Oh, I think you get that sense from both his books and other survivors that telling of what happens becomes the reason to survive. And this is a tremendously moving thing to me, because it sort of is the ultimate vindication of storytelling itself. That I have to get through this in order to tell the story of it. I don't think there's anyone whose books do that more forcefully than his.
Such a Jewish idea. Also, that's what the Passover Seder is the storytelling is at the essence of Jewishness.
Absolutely. In If There's a Man, I think he says something like, these are the new stories of the Bible. These accounts he's telling of the suffering that he's seeing around him are like new biblical texts.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, The Furrows by Namwali Serpell.
It's a fantastic book. It's structurally quite strange. It's unlike anything I've read before. I think it begins with a very arresting opening couple of lines, which is roughly, I'm not going to tell you what happened. I'm going to tell you how it felt. When I was a child, my brother drowned. And then what follows is a very realistic account of this boy drowning. And you're left with the question, well, is that what happened? Or did something else happen? And that's how it felt. The novel then proceeds in a sort of almost dreamlike logic where it becomes unclear what is memory, what's fantasy, what's reality, but in a way that always feels sort of urgent and emotionally truthful. It's sort of fast-paced, it's cinematic, and it's beautifully written.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Fervor by Toby Lloyd. I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned earlier about books being built on other books, retellings of jokes and biblical stories. You allude very directly to some biblical stories in Fervor. What did you have in mind? What biblical stories were you trying to rewrite or were you thinking of?
There were two stories that were first and foremost in my mind. One is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, and the other was the story of Jephthah and his daughter. And what these two stories have in common is that they both about a father who believes, at least, that he is commanded to sacrifice his daughter or his son, or is bound to sacrifice his son or his daughter according to God's will. To my mind, there's two key differences between the stories. One difference is that Abraham does not sacrifice his son. He saves him at the last moment, whereas Jephthah does sacrifice his daughter. And the other key difference in the story is one is incredibly famous and one is relatively obscure. And when I encountered the story of Jephthah and his daughter and realized that I didn't know it and that actually a lot of people don't know it, I thought that was fascinating because it seems to sit side by side with Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and Isaac is a story I kind of grew up with and has always sort of chilled me. I think it's supposed to be a chilling story, and I think a lot of Jews and Christians feel very uncomfortable with the story, not entirely sure what it's trying to tell us, and the way that, I guess, at the heart of it is the most appalling thing that any of us can probably imagine doing, which is having to kill our own child. So when I encountered the second tale on the same subject, I thought, oh, this is really like a preoccupation of the ancient Israelites for whatever reason. The child sacrifices, it's this sort of anxiety. So I was interested in, an early episode in my book is that the character Elsie encounters this tale and it really upsets her because, she's a teenage girl and she has a father whom she loves, and she can't quite work out what's going on in this story.
I note that you also have the father character tell Tovia about Kafka's The Judgment, which is
that's right,
also about a father who commands his son to kill himself.
That's true. I'd totally forgotten that was in the book, but you're absolutely right. That's a third story. And of course, the fourth story of father sacrificing the son is the Passion of Christ, the Gospels. So, that's another spin on that same narrative. And yeah, the Kafka story is well worth reading, The Judgment. It's horrible, but fascinating.
I wondered, as you mentioned, the mother character, Hannah, is a writer. She writes first about her father-in-law, and then she writes a book about her daughter, Elsie. In talking about that, it says she hadn't given Yosef a second life on the page. She'd done the opposite. You fix people in ink and you kill them. Even if they're already dead, you kill them over. They can't move, they can't breathe. They can only lie there stiff in whatever shape you bent them into. And if there's a chance, they will have their revenge. So I find it interesting that you both are talking about these killing your children stories and then have the mother write a book about her daughter, which you describe writing a book as killing someone almost.
Yeah. I think it is an anxiety that people have when they write memoir. It's not one I have because mine's a novel. But that if you write someone, the version of them that exists on the page is circumscribed. It's inevitably limited, and it both sort of freezes them, but it can't actually express who they really are. A person is more complicated than whatever jumble of sentences you try to provide. Of course, you're right. The metaphor of killing is an extreme one, and it does echo these other tales that we've been discussing, and in a way that is, when you pointed out, I think rather neat, but not necessarily what was on my mind at the time.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was an anxiety you shared, but I guess you won't be writing memoir anytime soon.
Well,
maybe.
I mean, I'd like to,
okay.
and that's one of the things it would scare me about it. And one of the great memoirs of our time, I think, is Carlo Knausgaard's huge multi-volumed book, and he agonizes. It's a very sort of self-aware memoir. It becomes this meta memoir, which by the time book 6 comes out, he's discussing writing book 1, and he talks about like, oh, I've written my wife's name down, but she's not there. The essence of her is not there, and he's saying this like, I'm a failure. Like as a writer, this has failed. The thing that I've put on the page is so diminished compared to the wondrous complexity of the woman who shares my life. And I think, if your characters are fictions, then like they're not competing in the same way.
I know you've spoken about the rich tradition of American Jewish fiction and your desire to contribute to British Jewish literature, which you feel is less visible. What do you hope Fervor adds to that conversation about British Jewish identity?
I guess what I would really like is for considering British Jewish identity as almost a sort of mainstream part of the culture. I think David Baddiel makes this point in his book, which I'm sure a lot of people have read, Jews Don't Count, is that a Philip Roth book seemed to be able to speak for and to America at large. The Saul Bellow book, I mean, what's the opening of Augie March? I'm an American, Chicago born. Again, these are the great American novel or whatever. Books by and about British Jews tend to be more marginal, tend to be seen as about a small minority group. And we are a very small minority group in this country compared with America. In a way, the great exception to this, ironically, in the British literature in the loosest sense is Ulysses by James Joyce, where the hero of the novel is a Jew, but he's not a Jew. It's not what is Britain today. It's Ireland, But I think more books like that, where Jews sort of sit at the heart of English literature rather than on the sidelines.
Yeah, you really delve into anti-Semitism and the wider context. You have Tovya's interview at Oxford. He's sitting in front of the committee. He sees they have his personal statement and he thinks, please don't read it aloud, he thought. The professor says to him, you say here that the modernist enterprise was poisoned by the toxic political ideas that were current at the time. I wanted to ask, what particular toxins did you have in mind? And of course, that's anti-Semitism and he doesn't feel like he can say it, and it, kind of explodes from there without saying any more. So you're clearly making the point that anti-Semitism is obvious in the past and in the present, but not allowed to be acknowledged. Is that your experience?
Is anti-Semitism allowed to be acknowledged? I think, yes. I think there's a certain kind of anti-Semitism that is sort of invisible to people. And I think really this is the argument that David Baddiel makes in Jews Don't Count, is that a lot of people, when they think about Jews, essentially think about Jews as being successful, assimilated, and wealthier than average, which might have some truth to it or might not. But regardless, the logical conclusion that therefore you can't discriminate against them doesn't actually hold. And I'll give you an example from my days as a university student. Was I wrote a paper on Philip Roth. Actually, I did a whole special topic on Philip Roth, and I was assigned a professor to teach me Roth studies. And day one, she says, I don't like Roth, and I haven't read most of his books. And, is that anti-Semitic? maybe, maybe not. But I didn't think this at the time, by the way. I thought this much later. If I was a lecturer at university, and, I work as an educator, so this is not foreign to me, and I was teaching a member of a minority group, like I was teaching a black student, and I'm not black, and she'd chosen to do Toni Morrison. And day one, I say, I don't like Toni Morrison. And you're with me for the next 6 weeks, and we're going to talk about how, and I have a position of authority. I would not in a million years do that. Because of the power dynamic, the diminishing of an artist, hopefully for obvious reasons. But I think people who would see how problematic it is for the white professor to immediately trash Toni Morrison to the young black student might not see that it's similarly problematic for day one of someone's rearing to go on their Roth studies for a non-Jewish professor to just trash Roth. And those are the sorts of dynamics I was interested in exploring in that scene that you mentioned.
Yeah, and you do have a lot of different kinds of Jews that are represented in the book who represent different strains and ideas. And similarly, around Israel-Palestine, you have a character who says, you want everyone to like you, don't start talking about Israel-Palestine. And then you continue to talk about Israel-Palestine with different characters voicing different views. I'm wondering what it's been like for you to have this book out 10/7. I imagine you were writing it before, just having it out in the world with these characters and going into this issue.
I think, the final edit, last proofread of the novel was done long before October. So it had nothing to do with the composition of the book. It absolutely affected the reception of the book, largely because every time I talk about it, people want to talk about it. They say, how has October 7th impacted the reception of the book? They want to talk about what I think about anti-Semitism now before October 7th. Several of the reviews kind of bring it up. It's awkward for me because it's not really the heart of what the book is about. I felt I had to write about Israel-Palestine because of the book I wanted to write, which is I wanted to show, you mentioned there are various different Jews in it. We have, in my book, we have Orthodox Jews, Reformed Jews, atheist Jews, Zionist Jews, anti-Zionist Jews. That's quite a broad spectrum. You can't have, I don't believe, a novel of 350 pages where you explore these characters and their views, and Israel-Palestine doesn't come up. It's just such an obvious elephant in the room. And my policy in writing the book is I wanted the characters to speak about how they saw events in the ways that they would, as truthfully as I could. I don't have something I'm trying to deliver, some message about the situation. I wanted to show how characters think about it. I wanted to show that it's important to some Jews that Israel is this appalling place that is trouncing human rights laws and is guilty of all these crimes. And other Jews believe that, everyone who says those things is anti-Semitic. And that's just a matter of fact. Like, that should be a totally uncontroversial thing to say if you talk to people and get a range of opinions. And to show how these opinions shape their family dynamics and can ruin a dinner. That's what I was interested in, rather than using the novel to soapbox about, here's what I think, guys. If I wanted to do that, I would pitch a straight up opinion piece to a newspaper. I don't think that's what novels are for.
I do appreciate that it's not the core of the novel, as you say. It's not really even like a central theme in the novel. And yet I think it really adds to the flavor of the book in portraying Jewry, that there are all these different opinions. And that also is a comment back about anti-Semitism, which often tries to ascribe a certain blame to a full group. So depicting lots of different views and lots of different experiences really adds to that. There's so much in the book here about mental illness and the supernatural and just the weight, as we've said, of inherited trauma, of memory, all of that. It's such a beautiful book. I'm really delighted that we had the opportunity to talk about it with you. Thank you so much for being here today and for sharing all of this with us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Toby Lloyd, talking about his novel, Fervor. You can find a link to the book and all the others Toby discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the great books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on Instagram at 5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. And also, we have a newsletter. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discuss directly in your inbox, you can sign up in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. You can find transcripts for all episodes online there too. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Sarah Waring. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Dina Friedman. Thanks especially to Lauren Wien and the Jewish Book Council.